The town of Bitter Creek didn't forgive women who were left behind. It was a Tuesday when they found the letter nailed to the church door. Not pinned, but nailed, like a wanted poster or a declaration of plague. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink still wet enough to smudge under a thumb, and it bore only 7 words in a hand that slanted like a man running. She knew. She lied. She stays silent. By Wednesday, they dragged Miriam Calhoun into the square. She didn't scream. That was the first thing people remembered later, when they told the story by firelight, with whiskey loosening their tongues. She didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't even lift her eyes to meet theirs. Just stood there, in the center of the dirt, with her hands bound behind her back, the rope already chafing her wrists raw, and the sun beating down on her bare head like the hammer of God himself. Her dress was the color of dust. It had been blue once, a wedding blue, some said, though no one could quite remember the ceremony. Miriam had always been a shadow at the edge of town, the wife of Thomas Calhoun, the banker who'd built the new rail office and shook hands with every landowner from the pass to the border. She'd been quiet, obedient, the kind of woman who kept her eyes down in the mercantile and her voice soft in church, until Thomas disappeared. 3 weeks gone now. No body, no horse, no trace, except the empty vault at the bank and the ledgers that didn't balance. Someone had to answer for it. Someone had to know. And Miriam, quiet, shadow-thin Miriam, had been the last to see him alive. "String her up," old Morton said from the crowd, his voice like gravel underfoot. "Witchcraft or thievery, don't matter which." Sheriff Kern stepped forward, boots kicking up dust. He held a branding iron, the letter L glowing orange at its tip. "Liar," he said flatly. "You'll wear this mark." Miriam's breath caught. The iron came closer, heat stinging her cheek. "Wait!" The voice came from the back, low and hoarse. A man stepped into the sunlight, tall, dusty coat hanging loose, hat pulled low. His hand rested on his revolver. "Name's Dalton Hayes," he said. "I rode with Calhoun." And the woman didn't lie. Confusion rippled through the crowd. "Thomas Calhoun is dead," Dalton continued. "I buried him myself. Shot in the back by someone he trusted." He tossed a leather journal at Kern's feet. "That's his real ledger. Every name, every deal. You want the killer? Start reading." Kern's face went pale as he opened it. "She didn't know," Dalton said quietly, his eyes finding Miriam's. "He kept her in the dark. That's what men like him do." The sheriff lowered the iron. The crowd shifted, uncertain. Before anyone could speak, Dalton cut the ropes at Miriam's wrists. "Can you walk?" She nodded. "Then walk." He turned toward the edge of the square. Miriam took one stumbling step, then another. The crowd parted. Behind them, a child's voice rang out. "Mama says Mrs. Calhoun makes the best apple cake." It was nothing, but it was enough. One woman lowered her eyes, another turned away. Dalton glanced back once, tipped his hat, and kept walking. Miriam followed. They rode in silence until the town became a smudge on the horizon. Dalton had 2 horses waiting at the edge of the scrubland, a gray mare for himself and a smaller paint horse that looked like it had seen better years. He helped Miriam mount without a word, his hands firm but brief on her waist, then swung onto his own saddle and turned north toward the broken country where the mesas rose like the ribs of some ancient, sleeping beast. Miriam's wrists throbbed. The rope burns were already darkening to purple, rings of shame she could feel with every shift of the reins. She wanted to ask where they were going, wanted to ask who this man was, really, and why he'd stepped between her and that brand. But her throat was dry as alkali dust, and the questions felt too heavy to lift. So she rode and watched his back. Dalton Hayes sat his horse like a man who'd been born in the saddle, loose, easy, but with a coiled alertness that never quite left his shoulders. His coat was faded cavalry blue, the kind ex-soldiers wore when they didn't want to forget, but couldn't bear to remember. A rifle rested across his lap, and his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the rocks, the arroyos, the distant line of cottonwoods that marked water. After an hour, he finally spoke. "There's a place," he said, not turning around. "Old line shack, 2 hours north. It's got a roof and a well. You can rest there. And then?" Miriam's voice came out rougher than she'd intended. "Then you decide." "Decide what?" Now he did look back, just a glance over his shoulder. His eyes were dark under the brim of his hat, hard to read. "Whether you run or whether you fight." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. They reached the line shack just as the sun started its slow bleed toward the western hills. It was a sorry structure, weathered planks, a sagging roof, one window covered with oilcloth. But the door still hung on its hinges, and when Dalton pushed it open, the inside was dry and empty, except for a rusted stove and a single wooden chair. "It'll do," he said. Miriam dismounted, her legs shaking from the ride. She'd never been a strong rider, never needed to be. Thomas had kept her close to town, close to the house, close to the small, safe world he'd built for her. Or the world he'd said he'd built. Dalton unsaddled the horses and led them to the well. Miriam watched him work, the efficient movements, the way he checked the mare's hooves, murmured something low that made her ears flick forward. He was gentle with the animals in a way he wasn't with people. When he came back inside, he was carrying a canteen and a cloth sack. He set them on the floor near the stove. "There's hardtack and jerky. Not much, but it'll keep you until morning." He paused, then pulled something else from his coat pocket, a small tin of salve. "For your wrists." Miriam took it, her fingers trembling. "Why are you doing this?" Dalton crouched by the stove, started building a fire from kindling he'd gathered outside. For a long moment, he didn't answer, just struck the flint, waited for the spark to catch. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I told you. I owed Thomas a debt." "What kind of debt?" "The kind you don't walk away from." The fire crackled to life, casting shadows across his face. "He saved my life in Sonora. Took a bullet meant for me. I told him I'd pay it back someday." He looked up at her then, and something in his expression made her chest tighten. "Didn't expect it'd be by saving his widow." "I'm not his widow," Miriam said, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Not really. I don't know what I am." Dalton stood, dusting off his hands. "You're alive. That's more than most get." He moved toward the door, and panic flared in Miriam's chest. "Wait, you're leaving?" "I'll be outside. Need to keep watch." He paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dying light. "Get some rest, Mrs. Calhoun. Tomorrow, we talk about what's in that ledger." "You read it?" "Enough." His jaw tightened. "Enough to know your husband wasn't just a banker, and enough to know the men who killed him won't stop until they've erased every trace of what he knew." The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Miriam stood alone in the firelight, the tin of salve cold in her palm. Outside, she could hear the horses shifting, the wind beginning its nightly howl through the rocks. She sank onto the chair, her whole body suddenly too heavy to hold upright. The rope burns pulsed. She opened the tin. The salve smelled of sage and something sharper, medicinal, and began to spread it over the raw skin. Each touch stung, but she didn't stop. Couldn't. It was something to do, something to focus on besides the weight of everything she didn't know. Your husband wasn't just a banker. She'd suspected, of course. A woman always knows when her husband is hiding something. The late nights, the locked drawers, the way Thomas would go silent mid-sentence when she entered a room, as if her very presence was an interruption of something larger, something she had no right to witness, but she'd never asked, never pushed. Good wives didn't. Now Thomas was dead, and she was branded a liar, in a town that wanted her blood, and the only thing standing between her and a noose was a stranger with a debt and a gun. Miriam closed her eyes, tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. All she could hear was Dalton's voice, low and certain. Tomorrow we talk about what's in that ledger. And somewhere deeper, quieter, like a whisper she wasn't ready to hear. Whether you run or whether you fight. Morning came cold and pale, the kind of dawn that offered no promises. Miriam woke to the smell of coffee, bitter, strong, boiled over an open fire. She sat up stiffly, every muscle in her body protesting. The wooden chair had become her bed. She'd been too afraid to lie on the dirt floor, too wary of what might crawl across her in the dark. Through the oilcloth window, she could see Dalton crouched by the fire outside, his hat tilted back, the leather journal open across his knee. He was reading slowly, his finger tracing the lines, his jaw working like he was chewing on something sour. She pushed the door open. The hinges screamed. Dalton glanced up but didn't speak, just poured coffee into a dented tin cup and held it out to her. Miriam took it, the heat searing her palms through the metal, but she didn't let go. The pain felt real, grounding. "You should sit," Dalton said. She sat on a flat rock near the fire, sipped the coffee. It tasted like ash and iron, but it was warm, and warmth was something. Dalton closed the journal and looked at her. Really looked, not the way men in Bitter Creek had looked, with judgment, or hunger, or contempt, but with something closer to calculation, like he was trying to measure what she could carry. "Your husband kept 3 sets of books," he said finally. "One for the bank, one for the town council, and this one." He tapped the journal. "The true accounting." "Of what?" "Everything." Dalton's voice was flat, but there was an edge beneath it. Land deals that never went through legal channels. Loans to ranchers that came with silent partnerships. Payoffs to the railroad surveyors to reroute the line through Morton's property instead of the Mexican homestead south of town. He paused. "And then there's the mine." Miriam's breath caught. "What mine?" "The copper vein up in the Cañón del Muerto. Thomas found it 2 years ago. Didn't file a claim, just bought up the land quiet, through fake names and proxy buyers. He was sitting on a fortune, Mrs. Calhoun. Enough to buy half the territory." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Enough to get killed for." The cup trembled in Miriam's hands. She set it down before she dropped it. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." "I believe you." His voice was quiet but certain. "Thomas didn't trust anyone with this. Not even you. Maybe, especially not you." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "But someone found out. Someone close enough to know his habits, close enough to get behind him without raising suspicion. Who? That's what we need to figure out. Dalton flipped the journal open again, turned it so she could see. The pages were covered in Thomas's cramped handwriting, names, dates, numbers. These initials here, JM, RK, EP, do they mean anything to you? Miriam stared at the page. Her eyes burned. JM could be James Morton. RK. She hesitated. Robert Kern, the sheriff. Dalton's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. And EP? Elias Pike. He owns the freight company. Handles all the supply runs to the railroad camps. Her voice was barely a whisper now. They were all at the house. For dinner. Cards. Business talk that I was never allowed to hear. They were all in on it, Dalton said. The land deals. The mine. Thomas was the architect, but they were the foundation. He closed the journal with a snap. And when they realized he was planning to cut them out, or maybe just take a bigger share, they killed him. The words settled over Miriam like a shroud. She thought of those men sitting at her table, drinking her tea, smiling their snake smiles, while she refilled their cups and kept her eyes down and played the part of the invisible wife. They'll come for me, she said. If they think I know, they already think you know. That's why they tried to brand you. Dalton stood, paced to the edge of the fire. They wanted you marked, discredited, a liar, a witch, whatever they could make stick. So if you tried to talk, no one would believe you. Then what do I do? The question came out raw, desperate. Run? Hide? Where would I even go? Dalton turned, and the look on his face was something between pity and respect. You could run. I'd help you. Get you on a train east, far enough that they'd never find you. Or you stay, and we make them answer for it. Miriam laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even her. How? I'm one woman with rope burns and a ruined name. They're the law. They're the money. They're scared, Dalton interrupted. His voice was hard now, certain. Men like that, they're only powerful when no one questions them. But you? You're a crack in their story. You're proof that Thomas didn't just run, that there's more to this than a banker's greed. He stepped closer. You walk back into Bitter Creek with this ledger, with your head up and your voice steady, and you tell them the truth. You become something they can't control. They'll kill me. Maybe. He didn't flinch. Or maybe enough people will listen. That child yesterday, the one who spoke up, that was the first crack. There'll be others. Women who knew you. Men who owed Thomas favors. People who were tired of Morton and Kern and Pike running things like their own private kingdom. He held out the journal. But it starts with you. Miriam stared at the worn leather, at the blood stain on the corner that she now realized was Thomas's. Her husband. The man she'd shared a bed with, a life with, and never really known. She thought of the brand, the letter L that would have marked her forever. Thought of the crowd's eyes, hungry for her humiliation. Thought of that little girl's voice, small and defiant in the silence. Slowly she reached out and took the journal. It was heavier than she expected. If I do this, she said quietly, if I go back, I won't be the woman I was. No, Dalton agreed. You won't. Miriam opened the journal, ran her fingers over Thomas's handwriting. All his secrets, all his lies. And somewhere in these pages, the truth that had gotten him killed. She looked up at Dalton. Teach me to shoot. For the first time, since she'd met him, Dalton Hayes smiled. It was small, barely there, but real. Yes, ma'am. They spent 3 days in the wilderness, and Miriam learned what her hands could do. Dalton was a patient teacher, but not a gentle one. He showed her how to hold the revolver, a worn Colt that had belonged to Thomas, found among his effects, how to steady her breath, how to squeeze the trigger instead of jerking it. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dust 6 feet from the cairn of stones they'd built as a target. Her second wasn't much better, but by the 3rd day, she could hit the center stone 3 times out of 5. Good enough, Dalton said, watching her reload with fumbling fingers that were learning speed. You're not going to outdraw anyone, but you can make them think twice. At night, they sat by the fire and went through the ledger page by page. Miriam read aloud, haltingly at first, then with growing steadiness, while Dalton listened and occasionally stopped her to explain what a particular entry meant. The numbers painted a picture she'd never wanted to see. Her husband, as architect of a scheme that had dispossessed homesteaders, corrupted officials, and concentrated wealth in the hands of 5 men who'd smiled at her across the Sunday pews. There's something else, Dalton said on the 3rd night, pointing to a series of dates near the back of the journal. These payments, all made the week before Thomas died. Large sums going to someone marked only as A.C. Miriam leaned closer to the firelight, squinting. I don't know anyone with those initials. Neither do I, but someone was being paid for something. And the timing? He trailed off, his jaw tight. You think it was the killer? Or someone who knew the killer was coming? Dalton closed the journal. Either way, it's leverage. One more crack in their foundation. On the 4th morning, they rode back toward Bitter Creek. The town came into view at midday, the church steeple first, then the false-fronted buildings of Main Street, the ragged sprawl of houses beyond. Miriam's hands tightened on the reins. Her whole body wanted to turn, to flee, to ride hard in any direction that wasn't this one. But she kept riding. They didn't go to the square. Dalton led them instead to the edge of town, to a small adobe house with a well-tended garden and chickens scratching in the yard. An older woman stood on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl. She looked up as they approached, her weathered face creasing with surprise. Mrs. Chen, Dalton said, dismounting. We need your help. Ada Chen had been a midwife in Bitter Creek for 30 years. She'd delivered half the children in town, buried the other half's mothers, and kept more secrets than the confessional. She listened without interrupting as Miriam explained, haltingly, then with gathering force, what was in the ledger, what had really happened to Thomas, what Morton and Kern and Pike had done. When Miriam finished, Ada was quiet for a long moment. Then she set down her bowl and wiped her hands on her apron. I'll call the women, she said simply. Give me 2 hours. By sunset, 15 women had gathered in Ada Chen's parlor. They sat on chairs, on the floor, on the window sills, wives and widows, shopkeepers and washerwomen, the invisible backbone of Bitter Creek. Miriam stood before them, the ledger in her hands, and told them everything. Some wept, some cursed. One older woman, Mrs. Fletcher, whose husband had lost his ranch to the bank 3 years ago, stood up halfway through and said, I knew it. God damn them, I knew it. When Miriam finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of Ada's mantel clock. Then Ada spoke. What do you need from us? Witnesses, Miriam said. Her voice was steady now, stronger than she'd ever heard it. Tomorrow is Sunday. The whole town will be at church. I'm going to stand up during service and read from this ledger. I'm going to name names. She met their eyes, one by one. And I need you to stand with me, so they can't drag me out, so they can't silence me again. They'll try, Mrs. Fletcher said bluntly. Kern's got deputies. Morton's got hired guns. Let them try. It was Dalton speaking for the first time from his place by the door. They want to start something in front of the whole congregation, with women and children present? Let's see how brave they are. The women looked at each other. Some nodded slowly, others hesitated. But one by one, they stood. I'll be there, Ada said. And I, said Mrs. Fletcher. My daughter deserves better than this, another woman said quietly. Count me in. By the time they left Ada's house, the plan was set. Miriam and Dalton spent that night back at the line shack. Neither of them slept much. Dalton cleaned his rifle, checked his revolver, then checked it again. Miriam sat by the fire, the ledger open on her lap, rehearsing what she would say. The words felt like stones in her mouth, heavy, sharp-edged, but solid. Just before dawn, Dalton spoke into the darkness. If this goes wrong, it won't, Miriam said. If it does, he continued quietly, you run. Don't try to be a hero. Just run, and don't look back. She turned to look at him across the dying fire. His face was half in shadow, but his eyes caught the ember light. I'm already running, she said. Forward this time. Sunday morning broke clear and cold. The church bell rang at 9, calling the faithful. By the time Miriam and Dalton arrived, she in a borrowed dress from Ada, he in his dusty coat with the rifle across his saddle. The pews were nearly full. They entered through the back door. Every head turned. The murmuring started immediately, whispers rippling through the congregation, like wind through wheat. Miriam felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their fear. But she kept walking, kept her chin up, kept her hand steady on the ledger. The women from Ada's parlor were scattered through the pews. As Miriam passed, each one stood. Slowly, deliberately, 15 women rising like a wave. Sheriff Kern half rose from his seat near the front, his hand moving toward his belt. But Dalton was already there, stepping into the aisle with the rifle held loose but ready, his eyes locked on Kern's. The sheriff sat back down. Miriam walked to the front of the church. Reverend Matthews stood at the pulpit, his mouth open in shock. She didn't ask permission, just stepped up beside him, set the ledger on the pulpit, and opened it. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't. My name is Miriam Calhoun, she said, and I'm here to tell you the truth about my husband's death. The church was silent as a tomb. Miriam's voice filled the space, steady at first, then stronger, each word a nail driven into the coffin of their lies. She read from the ledger, names, dates, amounts. The land stolen from the Martinez family, the falsified survey that rerouted the railroad, the copper mine in Cañón del Muerto that Thomas had found and 5 men had claimed as their own. James Morton, she said, her eyes finding the old rancher in the third pew. $40,000. Payment for silence regarding the northern boundary dispute. Morton's face went purple. He started to rise, but his wife, a thin woman Miriam had never seen speak, put a hand on his arm. He stayed seated. Robert Kern, Miriam continued, turning a page. 12,000, payments made monthly, listed as security consultation. She looked up at the sheriff, for looking the other way. Kern's hand was on his revolver now, but he didn't draw. Couldn't. Not with every eye in the church on him. Not with Dalton Hayes standing in the aisle like a promise of violence. Elias Pike, 18,000. Transportation of equipment and discretionary materials to the mine site. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. And then there's this. 1 week before my husband died, a payment of $5,000 to someone identified only as AC. The last entry in the ledger. She closed the book, looked out at the congregation, at faces she'd known for 5 years, at people who'd condemned her, at women who now stood scattered among the pews like sentinels. Thomas Calhoun was murdered for what he knew, Miriam said quietly. Shot in the back by someone he trusted. And when they couldn't find this ledger, they decided to destroy the only other person who might know where it was. Me. She touched her wrist, where the rope burns had faded to faint purple rings. They tried to brand me, mark me as a liar, so that if I spoke, no one would believe. "This is blasphemy," Morton bellowed, finding his voice at last. "You can't come in here and—" "Sit down, James." The voice came from the back of the church. An old man in a worn suit stood slowly, leaning on a cane. Ezra Holt, who'd been town magistrate before Kern took over law enforcement. He walked down the aisle with painful slowness, each step a statement. "I've known you 40 years, James Morton," Ezra said, "and I know when a man's caught." He turned to the congregation. "I want to see that ledger, and I want sworn testimony from everyone named in it." "You got no authority here anymore, old man," Kern said, his hand still on his gun. "Maybe not." Ezra's eyes were hard as flint. "But I got a memory, and I remember the Martinez family. Remember how they lost their land right after Thomas Calhoun started working for the bank. Thought it was misfortune then." He looked at Morton. "Now, I'm thinking it was theft." A murmur ran through the church. Heads turned. The crack was widening. "There's something else," Miriam said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, something she'd found tucked in the back of the ledger that morning. A letter, written by Thomas 2 days before he died. He knew someone was coming for him. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was rushed, desperate. "If you're reading this, I'm dead. I thought I could control them. Thought the money would be enough. But greed has no bottom. And I was fool enough to trust men who see loyalty as weakness. AC promised protection. I paid him to watch my back. Now I think he's the one who'll put a knife in it. Miriam, if this reaches you, run. Don't trust anyone. Especially not—" The letter ended mid-sentence. The ink smeared. "Especially not who?" someone called out. Miriam looked up. "He never finished. But I know who AC is now." She turned and looked directly at a man in the back pew. Young, quiet, always in the background. Aaron Cutler, Thomas's clerk at the bank, the one who'd handed her tea and condolences after her husband vanished, the one who'd nailed that accusation to the church door. Cutler went white. Then he bolted. He made it 3 steps before Dalton's rifle butt caught him across the temple. The clerk went down like a felled tree, blood streaming from his scalp. The church erupted. Women screamed. Men shouted. Kern drew his gun, but Ada Chen was suddenly there, stepping between him and Miriam, with her arms spread wide. "You shoot anyone in this church, Robert Kern," she said in a voice like iron, "and I'll make sure every woman in this territory knows you for what you are." Other women moved forward. Slowly, deliberately, a wall of calico and determination. Kern looked at his gun, looked at the women, looked at Morton, who'd slumped in his pew with his head in his hands. He holstered the revolver. "This ain't over," he said quietly. "Yes," Miriam said. "It is." 3 months later, the trial was done. Kern and Morton were sentenced to 20 years. Pike fled before they could arrest him, vanished somewhere into Mexico. Aaron Cutler confessed everything: how Thomas had promised him a share of the mine, then tried to cut him out; how Cutler had shot him in the arroyo and taken the bank's money, thinking the ledger was lost. He'd hang in the spring. The copper mine was seized by territorial authorities. The stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners, or their widows in some cases. It wasn't justice, not completely, but it was something. Miriam Calhoun didn't stay in Bitter Creek. She sold the house, Thomas's house, and bought a small plot of land north of town, near the line shack where Dalton had first taken her. It had a well, a creek, and enough flat ground for a garden. She built the house herself, with help from Ada Chen and the women who'd stood with her in the church. It was small, 2 rooms, a porch, a root cellar, but it was hers. Every nail, every board, every stone in the foundation. On the day she finished, Dalton Hayes rode up with a canvas sack in his hand. "Thought you might want these," he said, dismounting. Inside the sack were stones, smooth river rocks, each about the size of her fist, 15 of them. "What are they for?" Miriam asked. "Garden markers," Dalton said. "One for each woman who stood with you. Figured you could plant something living around them, something that'll grow." Miriam felt her throat tighten. She took the sack, felt the weight of the stones. "Will you help me place them?" "Yes, ma'am." They spent the afternoon laying out a circle in front of the house, setting each stone with care. When they finished, Miriam stood back and looked at what they'd made. The stones caught the late sun, casting small shadows. "What will you plant?" Dalton asked. "Wildflowers," Miriam said, "and apple trees, for the girl who spoke up about my cake." Dalton nodded. He started toward his horse, then paused. "I'll be heading west soon. Colorado, maybe. Got a lead on some work." "Will you come back?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Something like regret, or hope, or the space between. "If you want me to." Miriam touched her wrist, where the rope burns had become thin white scars. Marks she'd never hide. Proof she'd survived. "I do," she said quietly. "When you're ready." Dalton tipped his hat, mounted up, and rode toward the setting sun. Miriam stood among her circle of stones and watched him go. Then she turned back to her small house, her garden to be, her hard-won patch of earth. She had seeds to plant, and time now, and a story that would be told around campfires for generations, about the abandoned wife who refused to be erased, who turned shame into strength, who built a home from her husband's secrets and her own survival. The wind came up, carrying the smell of sage and coming rain. Miriam Calhoun picked up her shovel and began to dig. They say, if you ride past that plot of land on a summer evening, you can still see the wildflowers blooming around 15 stones. They say the woman who planted them never took another husband, never left that ground, but lived free and spoke true until her last breath. And they say every girl who hears the story asks the same question: would I have stood? The answer, like all true reckonings, lives in the asking.